My name is Cora, and at 58 years old, I thought I'd seen every kind of family drama possible. After raising my son as a single mother and weathering countless storms together, I believed our bond was unbreakable. But on what should have been the happiest day of his life, his wedding day, I discovered that sometimes the greatest betrayals come wrapped in white silk and wedding cake. What happened at that reception table changed everything I thought I knew about family loyalty and showed me that sometimes staying silent can speak louder than any words ever could. Before I share what happened that day, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Please hit that like button and subscribe, because this story shows how sometimes staying silent can be the most powerful response of all. Let's dive into a day that started with such hope, but taught me lessons I never expected to learn. Looking back now, I realize the warning signs were there from the very beginning, but love makes us blind to the things we don't want to see. My relationship with my son Marcus had always been special. When his father died in a car accident, when Marcus was just 12 years old, it became just the two of us against the world. I worked double shifts at the hospital as a nurse. To keep our little house, helped him with homework at the kitchen table every night, and cheered from the bleachers at every football game. Marcus grew up to be everything I'd hoped for. At 32, he was a successful accountant with his own firm, kind-hearted, responsible, and still called me every Sunday without fail. He'd never brought home anyone serious until 2 years ago, when he introduced me to Sophia. She was 28, blonde, petite, and worked in marketing for a luxury hotel chain. On the surface, she seemed perfect for him, but from that first dinner at my house, something felt off. While Marcus was at the kitchen, helping me serve dessert, Sophia wandered around my living room, picking up family photos with a strange expression. When I asked if she'd like to see Marcus's baby pictures, she smiled tightly and said she wasn't really interested in the past, only the future. The way she said it made my stomach twist, but I brushed it off as nervousness. Over the following months, I noticed small things. How Sophia would answer Marcus's phone when I called claiming he was busy. How she'd schedule their plans during times she knew I was free to spend with Marcus. How she'd interrupt our conversations to redirect his attention to something else. When I mentioned these concerns to Marcus, he'd just laugh and say Sophia was protective of their time together because she loved him so much. The engagement came 18 months later. Marcus called me excited beyond words, but when I asked to speak to Sophia to congratulate her, she was conveniently in the shower. The next day she called me herself with a detailed list of wedding plans that had apparently already been decided. The venue, the date, the color scheme, the guest count, everything was set in stone. When I gently suggested we might want to discuss some family traditions I'd hoped to include, she cut me off sweetly, but firmly. "Oh, Cora, that's so thoughtful. But Marcus and I really want this to be our own special day, you understand. We're not really interested in old-fashioned things." The way she dismissed decades of family tradition while calling me by my first name instead of any term of endearment stung more than I wanted to admit. But I swallowed my hurt and focused on Marcus's happiness. The next 6 months became a masterclass in subtle psychological warfare, though I didn't recognize it at the time. Every wedding-related event seemed designed to exclude me while maintaining plausible deniability. 6 months before the wedding, Sophia organized a bridal dress shopping trip. She invited her mother, her sister, her best friend, and 3 cousins I'd never met. When Marcus mentioned that I might want to come, she called me directly. "Oh, Cora, I would love to include you, but we're going to several boutiques in the city, and I know how much you hate driving in traffic. Plus, we'll be there all day, and I wouldn't want you to get tired." Before I could respond that I actually enjoyed shopping and had driven in city traffic for decades, she'd already moved on to discussing the date. Coincidentally, it was the one Saturday I'd mentioned I had off from my part-time weekend job at the clinic. 4 months before the wedding came the menu tasting. Again, Sophia scheduled it without consulting me, then called to inform me about it afterward. When I arrived at the country club, I found Sophia's entire family already seated and halfway through sampling appetizers. The coordinator seemed surprised to see me. "Oh, you must be the groom's mother. I thought everyone was already here. Sophia's laugh was like tinkling glass. Cora, I'm so sorry. I told them 5 o'clock, but maybe I said 6 to you. Time just gets away from me when I'm planning. I knew she'd said 5. I had it written in my calendar, but I smiled and took the empty chair at the far end of the table. During the tasting, every dish I expressed preference for was met with Sophia's wrinkled nose and comments about how heavy or old-fashioned my choices were. By the end, the menu consisted entirely of foods I'd never choose, but Sophia gushed about how perfect everything would be. 3 months before brought the guest list drama. Marcus called me sounding stressed for the first time during the engagement. Mom, I need to talk to you about the invitations. Sophia's family is larger than we thought, and the venue has capacity limits. My guest list had been modest. My sister and her husband, Marcus's godparents, 3 close friends from work, and my next-door neighbors who'd watched Marcus grow up. 14 people total. Somehow this was too many. Could you maybe narrow it down to just family? I know your friends would understand. I agreed, of course, because I wanted Marcus's day to be perfect. Later, I discovered through Facebook that Sophia had invited work colleagues she barely knew to fill the space that my friends would have occupied. 2 months before the wedding, I learned about the rehearsal dinner seating chart by accident. Marcus mentioned something about where I'd be sitting, and I was confused because no one had discussed the arrangements with me. When I delicately inquired, Sophia's response was swift and decisive. Oh, we've put you at a lovely table with Marcus's college professor and his wife. They're such interesting people, and we thought you'd enjoy the intellectual conversation. What she didn't mention was that this table was at the back of the room, far from the wedding party table, where all the other parents would be sitting. When I gently suggested I might prefer to sit with family, Sophia's voice took on a patient tone that made me feel like a difficult child. Cora, trust me on this. I've planned dozens of events through my work. This arrangement will be much better for conversation flow. The final dress fitting a month before the wedding was perhaps the cruelest cut. I'd found a beautiful navy dress, classic and elegant perfect, for a mother of the groom. When Sophia saw it, her eyebrows shot up. Oh my, that's certainly formal. I hope it photographs well with our color palette. Navy can be so harsh in pictures, especially with certain skin tones. She said it in front of the seamstress, her mother, and 2 other customers in the boutique. I felt heat rise in my cheeks, but managed to ask what she'd recommend instead. Well, you certainly know your own style best. I just want everything to be cohesive in the photos, you understand. I ended up buying a different dress in a softer grey that Sophia approved of with faint praise. Only later did I realize that grey would make me blend into the background in every photograph exactly as she'd intended. The week before the wedding brought a flurry of last-minute changes. The seating chart I'd finally been shown was revised again, moving me even further from the head table. The program listed Marcus's father as deceased, but failed to mention that I'd raised Marcus as a single mother. The mother-son dance song was changed to something Sophia preferred without my input. Each small slight could be explained away as wedding stress or oversight, but together they painted a clear picture of deliberate exclusion. The night before the wedding, as I lay in bed trying to quiet my racing thoughts, I made a decision. Tomorrow I would attend my son's wedding with dignity and grace, no matter what Sophia had planned for me. The morning of the wedding dawned crisp and clear, the kind of October day that makes you grateful to live in New England. I took extra care, getting ready, styling my hair in a simple but elegant updo, and applying makeup with a steady hand despite the butterflies in my stomach. The grey dress Sophia had approved looked lovely, even if it wasn't my first choice. I fastened my grandmother's pearl necklace, a family heirloom I'd hoped to pass to Marcus's bride someday, and took a deep breath. Driving to the venue, I allowed myself to remember Marcus as a little boy, how he'd practice walking down our hallway in his father's oversized shoes, pretending to get married. He'd always insisted I would be right there beside him when he found his princess. Today felt nothing like those innocent childhood games. The Riverside Gardens venue was breathtaking, with late autumn flowers cascading from every archway and fairy lights strung between century-old oak trees. Other guests were arriving in clusters, well-dressed families, laughing and embracing each other. I recognized some faces from Marcus's life over the years, but most were strangers, presumably from Sophia's extensive social circle. Walking into the ceremony area alone was harder than I'd anticipated. Other parents were grouped together, sharing stories about their children and complimenting each other's outfits. I found my assigned seat in the third row, behind 2 rows of Sophia's relatives I'd never met. The first row was reserved for immediate family, but apparently that didn't include me. Marcus's uncle David spotted me and made his way over, his face creased with confusion. "Cora, what are you doing back here? Shouldn't you be up front with the family?" Before I could answer, a wedding coordinator appeared with a bright smile and clipboard. "Excuse me, you must be in the wrong section. Family seating is clearly marked." David's voice was louder than I would have liked. "This is Marcus's mother." The coordinator's expression shifted from professional to embarrassed to confused in rapid succession. She glanced at her seating chart, then at me, then at the front rows, filled with Sophia's relatives. "I'm so sorry, there must be some mistake. Let me check with the wedding planner." But there was no mistake, and I knew it. I gently touched David's arm and smiled. "It's fine. I have a lovely seat here. We don't want to cause any confusion on Marcus's special day." As the ceremony began, I watched my son stand at the altar in his perfectly tailored tuxedo, his face glowing with happiness as he waited for his bride. When Sophia appeared at the end of the aisle, she was undeniably beautiful, in her flowing white gown, her smile radiant as she walked toward Marcus. For a moment, seeing them together, I almost forgot about all the small cruelties of the past months. The ceremony was brief but lovely. Marcus's voice was strong and clear as he recited his vows, promising to love and cherish Sophia for the rest of his life. When they kissed as husband and wife, I felt tears on my cheeks, despite everything. This was still my little boy, grown into a man who deserved happiness. After the ceremony, the photography session began immediately. I hung back, assuming I'd be called forward when they were ready for family photos. I watched as the photographer captured shots of the couple alone, then with Sophia's parents, then with her extended family. The poses grew more elaborate: siblings, grandparents, college friends, work colleagues. I waited patiently for 25 minutes before approaching the photographer myself. "Excuse me, I'm Marcus's mother. When would you like to take the family photos with his side?" The young photographer looked genuinely confused and glanced at his shot list. "I'm sorry, ma'am. I don't have you listed for any family groupings. Let me check with the bride." He walked over to Sophia, and I saw her glance in my direction before shaking her head and saying something that made the photographer nod apologetically. He returned with a sympathetic smile. "The bride says they're keeping the formal family photos small this year, but she'd be happy to have some casual shots taken later if there's time." There wouldn't be time, and we both knew it. I managed to maintain my composure, but inside something was breaking. To be excluded from my own son's wedding photos felt like being erased from his life entirely. During cocktail hour, the divide became even more apparent. Sophia's family and friends formed animated clusters around the outdoor bar, their laughter carrying on the autumn breeze. I found myself gravitating toward the edge of the patio, making polite conversation with other guests who seemed equally unsure of where they fit in the carefully orchestrated social hierarchy. Mrs. Patterson, Marcus's third-grade teacher, who'd clearly recognized me despite the years, approached with a warm smile. "Cora, how wonderful to see you. You must be so proud of Marcus today." Her kindness was a balm to my wounded spirit, and we chatted easily about Marcus's childhood and his accomplishments. But even this innocent conversation was interrupted when Sophia appeared at my elbow, her smile bright but her eyes cold. "Mrs. Patterson, how lovely that you could make it. I hope you're enjoying the venue. We chose it specifically for the photo opportunities." She positioned herself between Mrs. Patterson and me, effectively ending our conversation then guided the older woman away to meet other guests. I was left standing alone again, watching the sun begin to set behind the gardens. As cocktail hour wound down, I noticed how efficiently the staff and some family members were directing guests toward the reception hall. Everyone seemed to know exactly where they were going and who they'd be sitting with. Everyone except me. Standing at the entrance to the reception, I felt a familiar knot forming in my stomach. Whatever Sophia had planned for the dinner portion of the evening, I knew it wouldn't be pleasant. But I also knew that Marcus needed me to be there to show my support for his marriage, even if his new wife had made it clear I wasn't truly welcome. Taking a deep breath, I stepped into the beautifully decorated reception hall, ready to face whatever came next, with as much grace as I could muster. The reception hall was a vision of autumn elegance, with amber lighting, casting a warm glow over tables draped in cream linens and adorned with centerpieces of burgundy roses and gold leaves. A string quartet played softly in one corner, while guests found their assigned seats, the gentle murmur of conversation filling the space. I stood near the entrance, scanning the room for my table assignment. The seating chart was displayed on an ornate easel near the entrance, calligraphed in elegant script. I found my name at the very bottom of the list, Cora Williams, Table 12. Table 12 was positioned at the far end of the hall, partially obscured by a decorative pillar, and closer to the kitchen doors than the head table where Marcus and Sophia would be sitting. As I made my way across the room, I passed tables filled with animated guests who clearly knew each other well. Sophia's college sorority sisters were clustered at Table 3, her work colleagues at Table 4, her extended family, filling tables 1, 2, and 5. The head table gleamed with crystal and silver elevated on a small dais so the bridal party could overlook the entire reception. Table 12 held 5 other people, none of whom I recognized. An elderly couple introduced themselves as distant cousins of Sophia's late grandmother, a middle-aged man who turned out to be Marcus's former college professor, and his wife, and a woman about my age who seemed equally confused about why she'd been placed at this particular table. "I'm Janet," she said quietly as I took the remaining seat. "I work with Sophia's mother at the insurance company. I'm not sure why I'm not sitting with the other office people, but here we are." The college professor, Dr. Richardson, was kind enough sharing stories about Marcus's academic achievements and work ethic that warmed my heart. His wife was pleasant, but seemed more interested in critiquing the venue's decor than engaging in conversation. The elderly cousins spoke mostly to each other in whispers, occasionally glancing around the room with bewildered expressions. As the first course was served, I noticed Sophia making her rounds to various tables, stopping to chat and laugh with guests. She spent considerable time at each of the front tables, posing for photos and accepting congratulations. Her progress through the room was methodical and deliberate, working her way from the head table outward in concentric circles. When she finally approached our table, her smile was particularly bright, and her voice carried just a bit too clearly across the surrounding tables. "Oh my goodness, how is everyone doing back here? I hope you're all comfortable and enjoying yourselves." She made pleasant small talk with the professor about Marcus's college years, complimented the elderly cousins on their attendance, despite the distance they'd traveled, and thanked Janet for coming. Then her attention turned to me. "And Cora, you look lovely tonight. That grey dress is so sophisticated. I hope you're finding everything to your liking." Before I could respond, she continued with what seemed like genuine concern, but felt distinctly performative. "I wanted to check on you personally because I know you have such a sensitive stomach. I made sure the kitchen prepared something special for your dietary needs, and I told them to make it extra mild. I hope that's okay." I felt the attention of nearby tables shifting toward us. This was the first I'd heard about any special dietary accommodations, and I certainly had never claimed to have a sensitive stomach. In fact, I'd always prided myself on being able to eat anything. "That's thoughtful of you, Sophia, but I don't have any dietary restrictions." Her laugh was light and musical, but there was something sharp underneath it. "Oh, but remember at the menu, tasting how you mentioned that rich foods sometimes disagreed with you. I just want to make sure you're comfortable tonight." This was absolutely untrue, but she said it with such confidence that I could see doubt creeping into the faces of the people around us. Dr. Richardson was looking at me with the kind of concerned expression usually reserved for elderly patients with health issues. "Maybe you should taste everything first before diving in," Sophia continued, her voice now carrying to tables beyond ours. "Just to make sure it sits well with you. We certainly don't want any digestive issues during the reception." The suggestion hung in the air, like a challenge. Around us, conversation had quieted as other guests tuned in to what was happening. I could feel eyes on me waiting to see how I'd respond to what was ostensibly thoughtful concern, but felt unmistakably like public humiliation. "I mean, Mother, you know your own stomach best," Sophia added, emphasizing the word mother in a way that somehow made it sound patronizing rather than affectionate. In that moment, I understood exactly what was happening. This wasn't about food or concern for my well-being. This was about establishing hierarchy, about putting me in my place in front of all these witnesses. Sophia wanted me to feel small, elderly, fragile, and dependent. She wanted the assembled guests to see me as someone who needed to be managed and accommodated rather than respected. The smart response, the one that would have defended my dignity, would have been to firmly but politely correct her misstatements. I could have reminded everyone that I'd never mentioned having a sensitive stomach, that I'd worked as a nurse for over 30 years and was perfectly capable of managing my own dietary choices. Instead, I did something that surprised even myself. I looked directly at Sophia, smiled gently, and said absolutely nothing. I picked up my fork, took a normal bite of the perfectly ordinary chicken breast that had been served to everyone, and continued eating as if nothing unusual had happened. Sophia stood there for a moment, clearly expecting some kind of response. When none came, she tried again. "Is it okay? Not too rich for you?" I continued eating in peaceful silence, occasionally nodding to acknowledge the other conversation at our table, but completely ignoring Sophia's performance. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 30 seconds, she realized she wasn't going to get the reaction she wanted. "Well, wonderful. I'm so glad you're enjoying everything. I should check on the other tables now." As she walked away, I caught the expression on Janet's face, a mixture of confusion and something that looked like admiration. Dr. Richardson cleared his throat awkwardly and changed the subject to the string quartet's musical selections. But I could feel the shift in energy around us, a sense that something significant had just happened, even if no one was quite sure what it was. What Sophia didn't realize was that my silence wasn't submission or confusion. It was strategy. After months of small slights and subtle humiliations, I had finally recognized the game she was playing, and I had decided not to play it at all. The power of my silence became apparent almost immediately. As Sophia moved away from our table, I watched her work the room with renewed attention. What had seemed like natural social grace before now looked calculated and performative. She lingered at tables where she could be seen and heard her laughter just a touch too loud, her gestures slightly too dramatic. Within minutes of her departure from our table, I noticed Marcus's Aunt Linda approaching. Linda had always been perceptive, the kind of woman who noticed everything and forgot nothing. She bent down near my chair under the pretense of admiring the centerpiece. "What on earth was that about?" she whispered, her voice barely audible above the string quartet. I simply smiled and shook my head slightly, indicating I didn't want to discuss it. But Linda's eyes were sharp, and I could see her filing away what she'd witnessed for further consideration. 20 minutes later, during the second course, Sophia made another appearance at our table. This time she was accompanied by her mother, an elegant woman in her 50s, who had been nothing but polite to me during our few previous encounters. "Mother was just saying how much she loves the flowers," Sophia announced, gesturing toward the centerpiece. "I told her you might appreciate them too, Cora. I know how much you enjoy simple arrangements." Again there was that subtle dig wrapped in apparent thoughtfulness. The flowers were actually quite elaborate and expensive-looking, making her comment about simple arrangements another gentle insult about my presumed financial limitations or unsophisticated taste. "And I was telling Mother about your lovely gift." Sophia continued, her voice carrying to the adjacent tables. "So thoughtful for someone on a fixed income. Every contribution helps make our special day perfect." This was perhaps the cruelest cut yet. My wedding gift had been generous, more than I could comfortably afford, actually a check for $2,000, along with my grandmother's silver serving set that had been in our family for 3 generations. To dismiss it as the modest offering of someone with limited means was both factually wrong and deliberately humiliating. I felt heat rise in my cheeks, and for a moment I was tempted to set the record straight, but something held me back. Maybe it was the memory of my grandmother, who had always said that dignity was something no one could take from you unless you gave it away. Maybe it was the growing awareness that Sophia's behavior was becoming obvious to everyone around us. Once again, I responded with silence, taking a sip of my water and maintaining a calm expression. Sophia's mother looked slightly uncomfortable, glancing between her daughter and me, as if sensing undercurrents she didn't understand. "Well," Sophia said, after another awkward pause, "I should let you enjoy your dinner." As they walked away, I heard Sophia's mother say something quietly to her daughter, too low for me to catch the words, but with a tone that suggested mild concern or confusion. The third assault came during the salad course. This time, Sophia approached the microphone at the head table ostensibly to make announcements about the evening's schedule. She thanked various vendors, acknowledged out-of-town guests, and then, with perfect timing, made what seemed like a spontaneous decision. "Oh, and I also want to mention something special about our mother-son dance tonight. Originally, we had planned for Marcus to dance with his mother first, as tradition dictates, but Cora has graciously suggested that Marcus should dance with me first instead, since this is really about celebrating our new marriage." My fork paused halfway to my mouth. This was an outright lie. No such conversation had ever taken place, and the idea that I would voluntarily give up the mother-son dance was absurd. But Sophia delivered it with such confidence and apparent gratitude that it sounded completely believable. "So we'll do the first dance as bride and groom, then I'll dance with my father, and then Marcus will share a special moment with his mother. We just thought that order made more sense for photos and the flow of the evening." Around the room I saw heads nodding approvingly. What a thoughtful mother-in-law, willing to step back and let the bride have her moment. What a considerate way to handle family traditions. I could practically hear people thinking how reasonable and selfless I was being. Except none of it was true, and I had no idea she was going to make this announcement. Once again, I was faced with a choice: correct the lie publicly and create a scene, or let it stand and appear complicit in my own diminishment. I chose silence again, but this time it felt different. This time I was beginning to understand that Sophia's need to control the narrative was becoming desperate. Each successive attempt to diminish me was larger and more obvious than the last. She was escalating because my lack of response was denying her the satisfaction she craved. Dr. Richardson, who had been watching these interactions with increasing bewilderment, finally leaned over to me during a lull in the conversation. "You're handling this with remarkable grace," he said quietly. "I'm not sure I would be as composed in your situation." Janet from across the table caught his comment and nodded vigorously. "I've been watching too," she admitted in a low voice. "Something feels very off about all this." For the first time all evening, I felt a flicker of vindication. Other people were noticing. Sophia's behavior was becoming too obvious to ignore, and her targets were starting to see through the facade of concern and consideration. As the main course was cleared and preparations began for the cake-cutting ceremony, I realized that Sophia had made a critical error in judgment. By pushing too hard and too obviously, she was exposing herself. My silence wasn't making me invisible. It was making her manipulations unmistakable. The evening was far from over, and I had a feeling that Sophia's desperation to put me in my place was about to backfire in ways she never anticipated. The cake-cutting ceremony was scheduled to take place after the main course, a moment that should have been pure joy and celebration. Marcus and Sophia posed behind their 3-tiered masterpiece, decorated with cascading sugar flowers that matched the real arrangements throughout the hall. The photographer circled them, capturing angles and expressions while guests gathered around with their phones raised. Before we cut the cake, Sophia announced, her voice carrying across the now quiet reception hall. "Marcus and I want to make sure we get photos with all our important family members." She gestured gracefully toward her parents, who joined them behind the cake table with proud smiles. The photographer snapped several shots of the four of them together. Sophia's father's hand on Marcus's shoulder, her mother beaming beside her daughter. And now with the grandparents, Sophia continued, beckoning to her elderly relatives, who shuffled forward with assistance from other family members. More photos, more smiles, more poses, with bouquets and cake servers. I remained at my distant table, assuming that when they were ready for photos with Marcus's family, someone would call me forward. But as the minutes ticked by, and various combinations of Sophia's relatives rotated through the photo session, it became clear that no invitation was coming. Finally, Marcus himself seemed to realize the oversight. I saw him scanning the room, his eyes eventually finding me at table 12. He said something to Sophia, pointing in my direction. Her response was animated, her hands gesturing as she spoke close to his ear. Whatever she told him seemed to satisfy his concern, because he nodded and turned back to the photographer. The cake cutting proceeded without any photos, including Marcus's side of the family. When the formal photography ended, I watched as the photographer packed up his equipment and prepared to move on to candid reception shots. The opportunity for formal family photos was over. It was then that I overheard the conversation that changed everything. I had excused myself to use the restroom, needing a moment to collect myself after watching my exclusion from yet another family milestone. As I entered the elegant powder room, adjacent to the reception hall, I heard voices from one of the stalls, clearly unaware that anyone else had entered. "Did you see how she's treating Marcus's mother?" The voice belonged to someone young, probably one of Sophia's bridesmaids. "I know it's so weird," replied another voice. "Like, why is she being so passive-aggressive? The woman seems perfectly nice. My mom would lose her mind if someone treated her like that at my wedding," the first voice continued. "All that stuff about her sensitive stomach and fixed income I've been watching, and Mrs. Williams seems totally normal to me. And did you hear about the photos Sophia told the photographer that Mrs. Williams specifically requested not to be in the formal family shots because she gets nervous in pictures? But I saw her face when they were taking them. She looked heartbroken. My hands stilled on the bathroom counter. So that's what Sophia had told Marcus and the photographer. Another lie delivered with such confidence that it became accepted truth. "I think Sophia's intimidated by her," the second voice said. "Like jealous of how close Marcus is with his mom. My cousin went through the same thing with her mother-in-law. She couldn't stand that her husband actually liked his mother. Well, she's going to create problems if she keeps this up. People are starting to notice." The stalls flushed, and the two young women emerged, falling silent when they saw me at the mirror. Their faces flushed red with embarrassment at having been overheard discussing the bride's behavior. They mumbled awkward hellos and hurried out, but their words echoed in my mind. People were starting to notice. When I returned to the reception, the transformation was obvious once you knew what to look for. Conversations at nearby tables were more subdued, with occasional glances toward the head table and then toward me. Marcus's Uncle David was deep in discussion with his wife, both of them looking troubled. My table companions from earlier were whispering among themselves, their earlier confusion having crystallized into something approaching indignation. The breaking point came during what should have been the highlight of the evening, the dance portion of the reception. The DJ announced the traditional sequence of special dances, starting with the bride and groom's first dance. Marcus and Sophia glided across the floor to their chosen song, looking every inch the perfect couple. Guests gathered around the dance floor, some wiping away happy tears. Next came the father-daughter dance, with Sophia and her father sharing a tender moment to a classic ballad. Her mother dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief, clearly emotional at seeing her daughter so happy. Then came the moment I'd been dreading and anticipating in equal measure. The DJ's voice rang out across the reception hall. "Ladies and gentlemen, We'd now like to invite the groom's mother to join Marcus for the traditional mother-son dance. I began to rise from my seat at table 12, my heart pounding despite my attempts to remain calm. But before I could take more than a step, Sophia appeared at the microphone. "Actually," she said with a bright smile, "there's been a small change to our program. Cora has asked if we could save the mother-son dance for later in the evening, when there are fewer people watching. She's a bit camera shy, you know, and all these phones and cameras are making her nervous." The lie was so bold, so completely fabricated, that for a moment I couldn't breathe. Around the room, I saw confused faces, turning toward me, waiting to see my reaction to this supposed preference I'd expressed. But this time, something was different. This time, the lie was too big, too obvious, delivered to too many witnesses who had been watching the evening's dynamics unfold. Marcus's Uncle David didn't hesitate. He stood up from his table near the front of the room, his voice carrying clearly in the sudden quiet. "That's funny, Sophia, because Cora never mentioned being camera shy when she was taking pictures with Marcus all through his childhood. She was at every school play, every graduation, every celebration, always right there with her camera." The silence that followed was deafening. Sophia's smile faltered for the first time all evening, her grip tightening on the microphone as she realized her fabrication had been publicly challenged. David wasn't finished. "In fact, I think Cora would love nothing more than to dance with her son in front of all these people who care about them both. Wouldn't you, Cora?" All eyes in the room turned to me, waiting for my response. This was the moment I had to choose, continue my silence and let Sophia's lies stand, or finally speak up for myself and risk creating the scene I'd been trying so hard to avoid. But as I looked around the room, I realized the scene had already been created. Not by me, but by Sophia's increasingly desperate attempts to erase me from my son's wedding day. The guests weren't looking at me with pity or embarrassment anymore. They were looking at me with expectation, waiting for me to reclaim the moment that was rightfully mine. For the first time all evening, I broke my silence, standing there in that decorated reception hall, with dozens of eyes focused on me and the weight of the entire evening's humiliations pressing down. I felt something shift inside me. My voice when it came was steady and clear. Actually, I would love to dance with my son. The simplicity of those 8 words seemed to create ripples of relief throughout the room. I walked slowly but purposefully toward the dance floor, my chin raised and my steps even. Marcus met me halfway, his face a mixture of confusion and dawning awareness that something significant was happening. As he took my hand and led me to the center of the floor, the DJ, perhaps sensing the tension in the room, selected a song without asking anyone's preference. "The Way You Look Tonight," a classic that had been playing when Marcus took his first steps as a toddler in our living room so many years ago. We began to dance, and for those 3 minutes and 27 seconds, it felt like the rest of the world disappeared. Marcus was my little boy again, standing on my feet as I taught him to waltz around our kitchen. He was the teenager who'd grudgingly let me teach him proper dance steps before his senior prom. He was my son, fully grown, but still holding my hand with the same trust he'd shown when I walked him to his first day of kindergarten. "Mom," he said quietly as we swayed to the music, "I feel like I've been missing something important tonight." I looked up into his eyes so much like his father's and saw genuine concern there. "Have you been having a good time? You seem so quiet." It would have been easy to tell him everything right then, to unload months of small cruelties and tonight's public humiliations. But that wasn't what this moment was for. Instead, I smiled and squeezed his hand. "I'm having a wonderful time watching you be so happy." It wasn't entirely true, but it wasn't entirely false either. His happiness had always been my primary concern, even when it came at the cost of my own comfort. When the song ended, the applause was warmer and more sustained than it had been for any of the previous special dances. As Marcus escorted me back toward the tables, something unexpected happened. Instead of returning to distant table 12, he guided me toward the head table. "You should sit with us," he said, pulling out an empty chair that had apparently been reserved for late-arriving family members. Sophia's smile was frozen in place, as I settled into the chair beside Marcus, but she couldn't object without making a scene. For the first time all evening, I had a clear view of the entire reception and could actually hear the conversations happening around me. What I witnessed over the next hour was fascinating from a psychological perspective. Without me as a target at the periphery of the room, Sophia seemed to lose her focus. She became more scattered, her attempts at controlling the evening's flow less smooth and confident. When the bouquet toss was announced, she made a point of calling me forward to participate clearly, intending it as another form of subtle mockery aimed at my single status. But the joke backfired when several other women my age enthusiastically joined in, turning what Sophia had intended as embarrassing into something fun and inclusive. During the garter removal, she tried to make another joke about my presumed prudishness, suggesting I might want to step outside during this part of the evening. But by then, her pattern of targeting me had become so obvious that even her own relatives were exchanging uncomfortable glances. The final unraveling began when Marcus's cousin Jake arrived late, having driven down from Boston after finishing his shift at the hospital where he worked as a surgeon. Jake had always been particularly fond of me, crediting my encouragement with helping him get through medical school. As he made his rounds, greeting family members, Jake stopped at our table with a huge smile. "Aunt Cora, I'm so sorry I missed the ceremony. Surgery ran late, but I wouldn't have missed dancing with my favorite nurse for anything." Sophia, perhaps not realizing who Jake was, or how well he knew our family, made what turned out to be her final mistake of the evening. "Oh, you know, Cora. That's sweet. Just be gentle with her. She's been feeling a bit fragile tonight. All this excitement and rich food has been hard on her system." Jake's expression shifted from friendly confusion to something much colder. Fragile Aunt Cora worked double shifts in the ER for 20 years and raised Marcus completely on her own after Uncle Tom died. "She's one of the strongest people I know." He looked at Sophia as if seeing her clearly for the first time. "And there's nothing wrong with her system. She used to cook Sunday dinner for 12 people every week when we were growing up." The table fell silent. Marcus was staring at his new wife with an expression I'd never seen before, a mixture of confusion and something that looked like dawning comprehension. "Sophia," he said slowly, "why would you tell Jake that my mother was feeling fragile?" For the first time all evening, Sophia seemed genuinely flustered. Her carefully maintained composure cracked, and her response came out too fast and too defensive. "I was just being considerate. She seemed tired, and I thought, at her age, these long events can be exhausting." "At her age?" Jake's voice was incredulous. "She's 58, not 98, and she's in better shape than most people half her age." Marcus was now looking back and forth between Sophia and me, pieces of a puzzle clicking into place in his mind. "Mom, have you been feeling sick tonight?" Before I could answer, Jake jumped in with the kind of protective fury I hadn't expected. "There's nothing wrong with Aunt Cora, but there's definitely something wrong with someone who's been making her feel unwelcome at her own son's wedding." The accusation hung in the air like a challenge. Sophia's face flushed red, but whether from embarrassment or anger, I couldn't tell. "I have not been making her feel unwelcome. I've been nothing but considerate and thoughtful." "Thoughtful?" Jake's laugh was sharp. "Is that what you call seating her at table 12? Is that what you call excluding her from family photos? Is that what you call making announcements about her dietary restrictions that don't exist?" Each question hit its mark, and I watched Marcus's face change as he began to understand what his cousin was describing. Around us, other family members were tuning into the conversation, their expressions ranging from shocked to angry. Sophia tried to regain control of the narrative, but her usual smooth deflections weren't working anymore. "You're misunderstanding everything. Cora specifically asked to sit with the professor, and she told me she didn't want to be in photos, and she did mention having a sensitive stomach." "Stop." Marcus's voice cut through her explanations with quiet authority. "Just stop." He turned to me, his eyes filled with a pain that made my chest tight. "Mom, is any of that true?" This was the moment I'd been avoiding all evening, the confrontation I'd hoped to prevent by staying silent. But my silence had run its course. It had served its purpose by allowing Sophia to expose herself. But now it was time to speak. No, son, none of it is true. The simple honesty of those 6 words seemed to hit Marcus like a physical blow. He looked around the table at his family members' faces, reading the confirmation in their expressions, understanding finally what had been happening right in front of him all evening. When he turned back to Sophia, his new wife of less than 6 hours, his voice was very quiet and very controlled. "We need to talk, privately, right now." The conversation between Marcus and Sophia took place in the venue's bridal suite behind closed doors, while the reception continued in a subdued atmosphere. I remained at the head table surrounded by family members who alternated between comforting me and expressing their outrage at what they'd witnessed. Jake, still bristling with protective anger, was recounting to anyone who would listen the many ways Sophia had undermined and insulted me throughout the evening. David and his wife were discussing how they'd noticed the pattern, but hadn't felt it was their place to intervene. Even some of Sophia's own relatives were beginning to piece together the evening's events with new understanding. When Marcus and Sophia returned 20 minutes later, the change in both of them was immediately apparent. Marcus looked older somehow, the joy of his wedding day replaced by a weariness that made my heart ache. Sophia's perfect composure was gone entirely. Her makeup was smudged, her eyes red-rimmed, and her hands were shaking slightly as she approached our table. What happened next surprised everyone, including me. "Cora," Sophia said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I owe you an apology." The entire table fell silent, and I could feel the attention of nearby guests shifting toward us. I've been treating you terribly tonight, and for months before tonight. There's no excuse for it." Her voice broke slightly on the last words, and I found myself feeling something I hadn't expected: sympathy. Not for her actions, which had been deliberately cruel, but for whatever insecurity or fear had driven them. "I was threatened by your relationship with Marcus," she continued the words, coming out in a rush now, as if she needed to say them before she lost her nerve. "You raised such an incredible man, and he loves you so much, and I was afraid there wouldn't be room for me in that bond." Marcus stood beside her, his hand on her shoulder, but his expression was still troubled. This apology, while perhaps genuine, couldn't undo the damage of the evening or erase the months of calculated cruelty that had led to this moment. I convinced myself that if I could just minimize your presence somehow, that would make Marcus more dependent on me. I know how stupid that sounds now, but I felt like I was competing with you for his attention. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, smearing her makeup further. "And when you didn't fight back tonight, when you just stayed quiet and dignified through everything I did, it made me feel even worse about myself. So I kept escalating, trying to get some kind of reaction that would justify what I was doing." The honesty was brutal and raw, and I could see it was costing her something to admit these things publicly. But I could also see that Marcus was struggling with this revelation about the woman he'd married just hours ago. "Sophia," I said gently, "I appreciate your apology, and I understand feeling insecure about family relationships, but understanding doesn't excuse the cruelty." She nodded miserably, unable to meet my eyes. I know I've ruined everything. Your son's wedding day, our marriage, your relationship with Marcus. I don't know how to fix any of it." The pain in her voice was genuine, but it was Marcus's pain that concerned me more. He looked like someone who'd just discovered that the person he thought he knew best in the world was actually a stranger. "The reception is ending," he said quietly. "People are starting to leave. I think we should probably call it a night." And so my son's wedding reception ended, not with dancing and celebration, but with awkward goodbyes and confused guests filing out into the October evening, whispering among themselves about the family drama they'd witnessed. As I gathered my purse and prepared to leave, Marcus caught my arm. "Mom, I'm so sorry. I should have seen what was happening. I should have protected you." I hugged him tightly, this man, who would always be my little boy, regardless of how old he got or whom he married. "You couldn't have known," I told him, and meant it. Sophia was very careful to do these things when you weren't watching. That's how manipulation works. "What do I do now?" he asked, and the lost quality in his voice broke my heart. You figure out if this is something you can work through or something you can't, I said honestly. But you don't make that decision tonight when emotions are running so high. You take time to think, maybe talk to someone objective, and you decide what kind of marriage you want to have. He nodded, but I could see the weight of that decision already settling on his shoulders. As I drove home through the quiet streets of our small town, I reflected on the evening's events. My silence had indeed unraveled Sophia's perfect day, just as I'd hoped it might. But the victory felt hollow when I saw how much pain it had caused my son. The truth was that Sophia's apology, while necessary, couldn't undo months of calculated psychological warfare or the revelation of character flaws that went much deeper than wedding day stress. Marcus now knew that the woman he'd married was capable of sustained cruelty towards someone he loved, and that knowledge would fundamentally change their relationship, whether they stayed together or not. Sometimes getting what you want doesn't feel at all like winning. Sometimes the truth, even when it sets you free, comes at a cost that makes you wonder if silence might have been the better choice after all. But as I pulled into my driveway and sat in my quiet car, for a moment I knew that staying silent forever would have cost even more. It would have cost me my relationship with my son, my sense of self-worth, and my ability to trust my own perceptions of reality. The evening had been painful, but it had also been necessary. Now the real work of healing could begin. The weeks following the wedding were a delicate dance of rebuilding and recovery. Marcus called me 3 days later, his voice heavy with exhaustion and confusion. He and Sophia had spent their honeymoon in couples therapy sessions via video call rather than exploring the Greek islands they'd planned to visit together. "I keep thinking about all the times you tried to tell me something was wrong," he said during one of our long phone conversations. "All the hints I missed, all the times I chose to believe her version of events instead of trusting my own mother's feelings." I assured him that hindsight is always clearer than the present moment, that love makes us want to see the best in people, especially those we've chosen to build a life with. But I could hear in his voice that he was struggling not just with Sophia's behavior, but with his own role in enabling it. Sophia, to her credit, seemed genuinely committed to understanding and changing her behavior. She enrolled in individual therapy and wrote me a lengthy letter that arrived 2 weeks after the wedding. The letter was raw and honest, acknowledging specific incidents I hadn't even realized she remembered. She admitted to deliberately scheduling events when I wasn't available, to lying about my supposed dietary restrictions, to manipulating the seating arrangements and photo sessions. "I told myself I was protecting my relationship with Marcus," she wrote, "but I was actually poisoning it by asking him to choose sides in a competition that existed only in my mind." The letter felt genuine, but I also knew that actions would matter more than words. Trust once broken isn't easily repaired, especially when the betrayal was so systematic and calculated. Marcus and Sophia attended weekly marriage counseling sessions throughout the fall and winter. I stayed out of their process, offering support when asked, but being careful not to interfere with their attempts to rebuild their relationship. It wasn't my marriage to save or my decision to make. By spring, 6 months after the wedding, some things had changed, while others remained fragile. Sophia made genuine efforts to include me in family events and to acknowledge my role in Marcus's life. She sent me thoughtful birthday and Mother's Day gifts, invited me to dinner at their apartment, and even asked for some of my family recipes. But there was also an undercurrent of careful politeness in our interactions, a sense that we were all still walking on eggshells around each other. Marcus seemed happier than he had in those first difficult weeks after the wedding, but there was also a wariness in his eyes that hadn't been there before, a protective vigilance that suggested he was still processing the revelation of who he'd married. During one of our Sunday phone calls in late spring, he shared something that gave me hope for his future, whatever form it might take. "I've learned that I need to trust my instincts more," he told me. "All those times I felt like something was off, but talked myself out of it. All those moments when I chose to believe explanations that didn't quite make sense rather than trust what I was seeing. I'm not going to do that anymore in my marriage or anywhere else." The growth I heard in his voice, the hard-won wisdom that comes from facing difficult truths, made me proud of the man he'd become, even in the midst of painful circumstances. As for my own healing, it came gradually and in unexpected ways. The wedding had forced me to confront not just Sophia's manipulations, but my own patterns of avoiding conflict and absorbing mistreatment in the name of keeping peace. I realized that my silence, while strategic that evening, had been part of a larger pattern of minimizing my own worth and needs. I started seeing a counselor myself, someone who helped me understand that my desire to be the perfect mother and family peacemaker had sometimes made me an enabler of bad behavior. Learning to set boundaries while still expressing love was a skill I was still developing at 58 years old. The extended family relationships that had been strained by the wedding slowly began to heal as well. David and Linda became closer allies than ever, checking in on me regularly and making sure I knew I was valued and loved. Jake made a point of visiting more often, bringing his own girlfriend to meet me and treating me like the important family member I'd always been. Even some of Sophia's relatives reached out in the months following the wedding. Her aunt called to apologize for not speaking up during the reception, and her mother sent a card acknowledging that she should have noticed what was happening and intervened. By the first anniversary of the wedding, Marcus and Sophia were still married, but attending counseling less frequently. They seemed to have found a way to coexist that involved more honest communication and clearer boundaries. Sophia's treatment of me had become genuinely respectful, though it would probably never be warm or natural. Looking back on that October evening, I realized that my decision to stay silent had been both my greatest weakness and my greatest strength. It was weak because it allowed the situation to escalate far beyond where it should have gone, but it was strong because it forced everyone involved to confront the truth without my having to become the villain in Sophia's narrative. The lesson I learned and the wisdom I now share with other women facing similar family dynamics is that silence can be powerful, but it shouldn't be permanent. There's a time for quiet dignity and a time for clear, firm boundaries. The key is knowing when each approach is called for and being willing to shift strategies when circumstances change. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone is to let them face the consequences of their actions without rushing in to smooth things over or absorb the damage they've caused. Sometimes allowing someone you love to struggle with difficult truths is the only way they can grow into the person they're capable of becoming. Have you ever found yourself in a situation where staying quiet was more powerful than speaking up? What would you have done in my place that evening? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you for listening to my story and for your patience as I shared something so personal and painful. Please remember to like this video and subscribe to the channel if it resonated with you. And most importantly, remember that your worth isn't determined by how others treat you, but by how you treat yourself and what boundaries you're willing to maintain. Sometimes the greatest gift we can give ourselves is the courage to stay silent when words won't help, and the wisdom to speak up when silence becomes complicity. May you always know the difference, and may you always choose the path that honors both your dignity and your love for the people who matter most in your life.